Hello and welcome to episode 12 of Lex Out Loud, world building for science fiction. I'm your host, Lex Starwalker. I'm working on my third novel, my first science fiction novel, and I'm taking you along with me for the ride. In season 1, we're exploring world building in depth. So welcome back to the show, everyone. Great to be back talking with you today. It's actually been a little while since I recorded the last episode. And so it's really great to be back behind the mic again, talking about world building, talking about this amazing, at least to me, setting that I'm creating for these books I want to write. So one of the major features of the setting I'm working on are these rotating cylinder-shaped habitats for living in space. And I've talked about these in previous episodes. So if you're a new listener, maybe go check those out first. But you do what you want. So ultimately, these cylinders will be located in orbit of Earth, the Moon, Mars, the asteroid belt, and beyond. And I've done a lot of work fleshing these out. And today I'm going to share some of the details I've come up with you. Now, if you're a listener in the future and you're a reader of my books wanting to know more about these cylinder cities, then this episode's for you. You're going to love this stuff because this is going to be a lot of details that will probably never be in any of the books. So some background information that this might be the only way to get that information. So please enjoy. And for present day listeners, this is going to bring us up to date on where I'm at in the world building of these habitats and their role in the setting. So this is kind of an update of my discussion of the development of this setting. So I've been working a lot on this and getting a lot done on the setting in the past few weeks, and I fleshed a lot of it out. There's still one pretty sizable issue I'm wrestling with, and I'm not going to go into that today, but I'll discuss that in a future episode, along with more of an overview of what I've got so far about the setting. And that's actually what I was planning to do today, and that's what I started to prepare for today. But as I was writing out the script, the discussion on the cylinder habitats quickly grew to the point where it needed its own episode. So here we are. Real quickly, though, before we dive into orbiting spinning cylinder habitats, I just want to say that, let's see, it's a few days ago now, the Mars rover sent by NASA, Perseverance, landed on Mars. And I watched that live, and it was super, super cool. You've probably heard about it. It's been in the news quite a bit. One thing really cool about this rover is it has video cameras and it has microphones, which none of the rovers before had microphones. And just yesterday, I think it was, NASA released footage from Perseverance of its landing on Mars, and it's really amazing, really awesome. So I will have that video for you in the show notes if you want to check that out. If you haven't seen it, check it out. It's not very long, a couple minutes, but it's super cool. And you will get to see actual real footage of Mars like you've never seen it before. Super cool stuff. So check out the show notes for that. And by the way, if you're into this kind of stuff, space news and what's going on in space exploration, highly recommend that you follow me on Twitter at Lex Starwalker. I tweet a lot about space news. I follow a lot of NASA and astronaut accounts and SpaceX and Blue Origin and Virgin Galactic and all those companies. So I try to post any interesting news I find. And another great place to go is our Discord community, which you can join for free. And again, links to that are in the show notes as well at starwalkerceos.com/LOL. And join us on Discord. And we have a lot of great discussions there. And yeah, please join us. All right. So, as I said today, we're going to talk more about these cylinders. I can't get enough of these things. And it's funny, they're even in the news a bit lately. And I think it's largely due to one or more statements that Jeff Bezos, owner of Blue Origin, made about wanting to build an O'Neill cylinder. Personally, I'd rather see us a little more focused on something like that than on sending people to Mars. I think sending robots to Mars is awesome, and we should keep doing that. I think trying to send humans to Mars right now is a little premature. I feel like we should be focused more on the moon and cislunar space and building orbitals with rotating artificial gravity. Those seem like kind of necessary preliminary steps before sending people to Mars, because Mars does have lower than Earth gravity. So people aren't going to be able to live on the surface of Mars indefinitely without there being negative health effects. So even when we do have people, quote, on Mars permanently, it's much more likely that they will be in some kind of rotating orbital habitat than living on the surface of Mars. I'm sure we'll have bases on the surface of Mars, but people will only be able to stay there for a limited amount of time, just like astronauts can only be on the International Space Station for a limited amount of time because there's less gravity than Earth. And there's all kinds of health problems that arise from being in lower than Earth gravity, things like bone density, problems with your eyes, all kinds of stuff, not to mention cosmic radiation and things like that. So I mentioned this in a previous episode that I need to learn more about why, for instance, SpaceX and NASA are so focused on sending people to Mars. Because like I said, it just seems like it just makes me scratch my head. I feel like, they're putting the cart ahead of the horse a little bit here. But I'm sure there's good reasons. So I still need to look into that. But anyway, O'Neill cylinders have been in the I don't know, the popular media a bit lately, more so than in the past. So you may have heard of them or be aware of this concept. And again, if you're not, check out earlier episodes where I go into the introductory aspects of that. So one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is the actual size of these things. How big will they be? And how many people will live on them? Again, one of the initial ideas that this whole thing sprang from, one of the core initial kind of seed ideas of this setting was of cylinder-shaped rotating habitats that were city-sized, with populations like that of a modern city. So that's what I'm shooting for. And that's where the story will take place is on something like that. But like I've also said a lot on this show, I'm trying to ground things in reality as much as possible. A lot of the popular science fiction out there is very space opera. It's very, very, in my mind, much more fantasy than sci-fi, because it's not based on science much at all. Things like Star Trek, Star Wars, Firefly, you name it. And pretty much any popular science fiction is space opera. Even The Expanse, which has a lot more nods to reality than we're used to, is still not by any stretch hard science fiction. The Epstein drive in The Expanse is impossible. It's not hard sci-fi. It's not based on current science at all. And I talked about that in previous episodes too, what's called a constant acceleration drive, and how you just can't make something like that's going to accelerate at 1G constantly, which is what the ships on The Expanse do. It's just not possible. Even if you had antimatter as your fuel, which they don't on The Expanse, but even if you did, you would have to have your reactions at pretty much 100% efficiency, which probably isn't possible to get anywhere close to that. So yeah, it's space opera, it's make-believe. And I'm not disparaging that, but I am wanting to do something that's much more grounded in reality, something more like The Martian, where as much as possible, it's based on our current understanding of science and how things are, because I don't want this to be a fantasy. I want it to be relatable to everyone. And I want to show as accurate a picture as I can of what the near future may actually look like. And unfortunately, most of the science fiction that most people who aren't super into science fiction are familiar with, again, things like Star Trek, Star Wars, etc., are not that. They're very fantastic. They're very unrealistic. And, for instance, Star Trek, I'm not going to say that that's impossible, but if it were possible, it would involve physics that we're not currently aware of. And you're talking something thousands of years in the future, not decades or even hundreds of years. So not super relatable for people today, especially just your average people that aren't super into sci-fi. So just like Game of Thrones, I think brought in a sizable audience that before Game of Thrones really had no interest in fantasy. I'm hoping that what I'm doing can do something similar for science fiction, where even someone who is not a sci-fi fan could pick up my book, read it, enjoy it, understand it, and hopefully be inspired about the future and what's possible if we all just work together. So yeah, trying to ground in reality as much as possible. So thinking about the cylinders, how big would they be? How big could they be? If I want one big enough to support the population equivalent to a city, what are we talking about? So it turns out there's a very important relationship between the size of a cylinder, specifically its radius or its diameter, the height of the cylinder, and the rotation rate or the rotation speed needed to produce 1 g of artificial gravity, which is to say when you're standing on the inside surface of this cylinder, you're feeling the same force that you would feel on Earth as far as the apparent gravity that you're feeling. So if you weigh 100 pounds on Earth, you would weigh 100 pounds on this rotating cylinder. So if you'll remember our past discussion of O'Neill cylinders, which are much taller compared to their radius than Kalpana type cylinders, which is more what my cylinders are going to be. O'Neill's design involved 2 cylinders who are connected together and rotate in opposite directions at the same speed. So if one cylinder is rotating clockwise at 1 RPM, then the other cylinder is rotating counterclockwise at 1 RPM. And the reason for this is that due to a force called gyroscopic precession, if you just rotate a long, narrow cylinder, and these look very much like if you think about the tanks used for welding or like an oxygen tank, like a scuba diver would wear, the O'Neill cylinders are shaped like that. They're very long compared to their diameter. So if you have a cylinder like that, a very long, narrow cylinder that's rotating around, its diameter, its narrow diameter, due to these gyroscopic forces, eventually that cylinder will actually start flipping end over end. And obviously if that cylinder is a massive rotating habitat with people inside, that would be catastrophic if this thing just starts flipping end over end. So the way O'Neill solved that problem was by having the 2 counter-rotating cylinders connected together. And this works because the gyroscopic precession forces of the 2 cylinders cancel one another out because they're rotating in opposite direction. And in physics, equal and opposite forces cancel out, just like adding +1 to -1 equals 0. So if you have 2 equal forces going in opposite directions, they cancel out. So that's how the O'Neill cylinders work. So you actually have to have 2 of them together. And that's one way to keep them stable, keep them from flipping end over end, is you have these 2 cylinders together that are rotating in opposite directions. Another way that you can make this work and keep your cylinder stable, and this is how the Kalpana cylinders work, as described in the Kalpana 1 paper that I've discussed in previous episodes, is to instead make the cylinder shorter compared to its radius or our diameter. So the folks who wrote the Kalpana 1 paper explain that you need to limit the height of a rotating cylinder to less than 1.3 times the radius of that cylinder to keep it stable. So instead of a cylinder that would look something like a scuba tank, very tall and narrow, the Kalpana cylinder has dimension ratios that would look more like if you took two hockey pucks and stacked them on top of each other. So a much wider, a much larger diameter cylinder and shorter compared to, if you think of a hockey puck compared to a scuba tank. That's what we're talking about here. So the scuba tank would be your O'Neill cylinder. The hockey puck would be your Kalpana cylinder. So yeah, as long as you keep the height of your cylinder less than 1.3 times the radius, that cylinder will rotate stably and it won't start flipping end over end like a single O'Neill cylinder would. And just as a reminder, for those of you like me that it's been a long time since you took a math class, I'll be using radius and diameter a lot in this discussion. And just remember that a radius is half a diameter. So if you're talking about a circle or a cylinder, the diameter is the total width of it, and the radius is half that, or it's the distance from the center of the circle to the outside of the circle. So just keep in mind, radius is half of diameter, or diameter is twice the radius. So as I said, radius, height, and rotation rate, and the artificial gravity produced in one of these cylinders are all related. All these numbers affect one another. And we just talked about how radius and height are related. So if you just have a single cylinder, you got to keep that height less than 1.3 times the radius. Now let's talk about rotation rate and artificial gravity and how all that works. So our main parameter here for these cylinder habitats is we want to provide 1g of artificial gravity at the inside surface of the cylinder. So we want perfect Earth-like gravity of 1g. We don't want any less than that. We don't want a half a G or a third of G or a quarter of a G or even 0.9 G. We want 1G because, we're talking about cities here. So it's not just going to be astronauts living in these cylinders, but also just normal people. And honestly, at least for the early ones, it's going to be a lot of space construction workers, or probably more to the point, a lot of robot handlers and robot programmers living on these things, not necessarily trained astronauts. Also, people who live out their lives there, or I should say people will live out their lives there. So any gravity less than 1G, anything less than Earth gravity is undesirable. Like I said, even 0.9 G, or that would be 90% the gravity of Earth, is probably not going to be good enough. Now, we don't have a lot of data on the values between microgravity like we have in low Earth orbit and 1G. So we don't know specifically what the effects of living at half a G are, or what the effects of living at 3/4 of a G are. We don't have that kind of data yet, but we do have data from people living in microgravity because we have people that stay on the International Space Station for months. And before that, we had Skylab. So we do have information on that. And we do know, like I said before, that astronauts that stay on the space station in microgravity, there are a lot of negative health effects of that. And those effects grow over time. So you're going to feel those effects a lot more if you're on the space station for 6 months than you would for 3. But just some of those things, you lose bone density, you lose muscle mass. It affects the integrity of your eyeballs, and your eyes can lose their shape, which affects your vision. And, there's lots of other stuff too. And again, another whole discussion is we have no idea how or if human procreation would work in less than 1G. Is it even possible? Is sexual reproduction even possible? Can an egg even fertilize? Whoa, got that backwards. Can a sperm even fertilize an egg in less than 1G or not? And even if it can, will the embryo develop normally in less than 1G? We don't know. Again, studies will have to be done to figure that out. But in the meantime, it's pretty safe to just assume, and the safe assumption is that we need to be at 1G, and anything less than that is not going to fly, especially when you're talking about people living out their entire lives in space, which is what I'm talking about here. People will be born, live, and die on these cylinders, so they're going to live their entire lives there. So it's got to be 1G. Anything less is not going to work for a permanent settlement. And again, like Mars, I think is about a third the gravity of Earth. So we can't have people living on Mars long term. They'd have to live in orbit in a rotating habitat at 1G. Now, it may turn out as more research is done that maybe a third of a G on Mars will be enough that, there won't be any problems with reproduction or embryo and child development and things like that. But we don't know that. We don't have that information yet. So the safe assumption is that we need 1G. So that's the assumption I'm making for this. So this is all related: radius, height, and rotation rate. So the rotation rate is also known as angular velocity. That's the technical term for it. And it's expressed in RPM, or revolutions per minute. So this is, if you're talking about like a tire on your car, how many times does that tire spin all the way around in 1 minute? So if the RPM is 50, you're saying that tire spins 50 times in 1 minute, revolutions per minute. So that's what RPM means. And that's how we express how quickly something is rotating. So this is a key figure, not only because that's what determines the force of our artificial gravity, that's what gets us to 1G, but it's also directly involved in the comfort of the people living in the cylinder. So not only do we want the cylinder to rotate enough to give 1G of gravity, but we also want the average person to be able to live there and be comfortable and not be sick as a dog all the time. Because again, just normal people are going to be living there. It's different if you're talking something for astronauts that trained and have been selected people who get super space sick, probably don't make it long as astronauts. So when you're dealing with people like that, you can have higher rotation rates and things like that, and they'll be okay. But your average person, you have to plan for the lowest denominator, or the person that would be the most sensitive to this kind of stuff, and make them comfortable if you're going to have a city on one of these things. So the whole reason for all of this, I just mentioned space sickness, is how our inner ears work and sense the motion of our bodies, what's called the vestibular sense. So you have 3 little tubes within your inner ears that are filled with fluid, and one tube is oriented vertically, one's horizontal, and then the other one's at an angle. And I've got an illustration of that in the show notes at starwalkerstudios.com/LOL. You can check that out. And then inside these tubes that are filled with fluid are tiny little hairs. So as you turn your head around, as you move your body around, the fluid in these different tubes moves in different ways, and it moves these little hairs, which are connected to nerves, which communicate to your brain, which figures out what's going on based on these signals. And it knows, whether your head is turning or moving up and down, whether your body is moving, whether you're going up or down or left or right or forward or backwards, all those things. That's how that works. So, that's why, for instance, if you sit on like a spinning office chair and you spin yourself really fast in one direction with your eyes closed, and then stop and spin the other way with your eyes closed immediately, there's a moment where you'll feel very disoriented and you can't really tell which way is what, because the fluid in your ears is moving in a way that your brain isn't used to, and it gets confused. So that's a fun little experiment to do if you've never done that. And you can kind of see how this works. And this is where motion sickness comes from, like we have here on Earth, like getting car sick or getting seasick or getting air sick, all involve this vestibular sense. So what happens with motion sickness is basically your eyes are telling your brain one thing and your vestibular sense is telling your brain the opposite. So your eyes are telling your brain that you're still. So maybe you're reading a book while you're riding in a car. So you're in, the cabin of a car. You're not looking out the window. So your eyes are telling you that you're sitting still. And at the same time, your vestibular sense, your inner ears are feeling the motion of the car and telling you that you're moving. So your brain is getting two conflicting signals. And this discrepancy in the brain is what makes you feel sick. If you're someone who's prone to motion sickness, this is what makes you motion sick, is the fact that, your eyes are telling your brain you're moving, while your inner ears are telling your brain, or I'm sorry, your eyes are telling your brain that you're not moving, while your inner ears are telling your brain that you are. And that conflict makes you feel sick. So, as an interesting side note to this, space sickness, which you can get the same kind of thing happening like when you're in orbit, is basically the obvious, oh my gosh, the opposite. That was kind of a funny typo there. It's the opposite of terrestrial or Earth-based motion sickness. So like I said, if you're talking air sickness in an airplane or a helicopter, or seasickness on a ship, or car sickness in a car, it's a conflict of your eyes telling you you're not moving and your vestibular sense telling you that you are moving. In space, it's actually the opposite. So in space, your eyes are telling you that you are moving because you look outside of the window of the space station and you see Earth. You see yourself flying very, very fast over the surface of the Earth as you're orbiting. So your eyes are telling you that you're moving, but that vestibular sense, since you're in microgravity, is telling you that you're not moving. So it's actually the same thing, but opposite as motion sickness here on Earth. And the interesting thing is the two aren't related. So just because you get seasick or car sick on Earth doesn't mean that you'd get motion sick in space. You might not. They're not related. And the opposite is true. Just because you don't get car sick on Earth doesn't mean that you won't get space sick, because they're different. They're not related. So again, if you get motion sick easily on Earth, it doesn't necessarily mean that you'd easily get space sick and vice versa, which was pretty cool because I am someone that does fairly easily get motion sick. I get seasick. I don't actually get air sick. I've never gotten air sick, but well, at least not when someone else was flying. Some of my early pilot lessons, I did get air sick, but that was I was not flying in a way that you would normally fly in a plane. So that was pilot error, I think. But I can get very easily motion sick in a car when I'm not driving, or if I'm sitting in the back seat, or if I try to read or something in a car, I will get sick. And I do get seasick anytime I've been on a ship in choppy waves or whatever. I've gotten pretty sick. So I always assumed that I would get space sick and I wouldn't be able to go in orbit or something like that. I'd be sicker than a dog. But it turns out that's not necessarily true. I might not. I wouldn't know until I went up there. So something also interesting I learned as a side note on this is I learned even astronauts that have been doing this for a long time, anytime an astronaut is wearing an EVA suit, the spacesuit with the helmet and everything else, where they can go out and vacuum, and for instance, they wear those during launch. And also, of course, when they do extravehicular activity, when they leave the space station for a spacewalk, whenever they're wearing one of those suits with the helmet on, they always use a transdermal patch with a medication that prevents nausea and vomiting. I didn't know that. And the reason is vomiting in your spacesuit, not only would it be super gross because all that puke is floating around inside your helmet with you, but it could also be deadly, which I hadn't thought about before. I always just thought about the gross aspect of it. So just imagine, vomiting inside your helmet in zero gravity, not pretty. So it can block your vision out of the front of your helmet. It can get in your eyes, and you can't get your hands to your face because you got a helmet on, so you can't get it out of your eyes. So it can prevent you from being able to see. And it can also clog up the ports that the air comes into your helmet and that takes the CO2 out. So it can actually suffocate you. So yeah, that would be very bad. So anytime astronauts are wearing these or they're going on a spacewalk or anything like that, they use these transdermal medicine patches, kind of like a patch to quit smoking, but it has a medication that prevents nausea. So that was a cool thing I learned. All right, so back to our cylinders. So let's say you have one of these huge cylinders rotating for artificial gravity. You're standing on the inside surface of it, feeling 1G of gravity. If you were standing on that, facing the direction of rotation, and you turned your head, you would actually feel the spin of the cylinder in that vestibular sense. And there's a great manifestation of that illustrated in a video clip that shows this really great from the show The Expanse. And I'll have that in the show notes as well, because as part of this, it's called the Coriolis Effect. And I'll go into a little more on this in a second. But when you drop something on one of these, it will appear not to fall in a straight line. So there's this great clip, and they do this a few times in The Expanse, where someone's on a rotating habitat and they're pouring a drink, and the water, you see it go at an angle. So check out that clip. It's super cool and just kind of illustrates this Coriolis effect really well. So if you're standing on one of these cylinders, you're facing the direction of rotation. So the floor of the cylinder that you're standing on would seem to rise up gently in front of you and behind you, because that's the shape of the cylinder. If you're facing that way and you turned your head left or right, you would feel that spin, because you are in something spinning around in a circle, and your vestibular sense will feel that when you turn perpendicular to the direction of rotation. Also, if you were standing on one of these cylinders and you poured water on the ground or in a glass, or if you drop something, it would appear not to fall straight down like it would here on Earth, but it would appear to fall at an angle. And again, you can check out that clip from The Expanse in the show notes, and it shows that. And it's super cool. It's a beautiful illustration of that. And the reason that it happens that way, let's say you pour out water and it seems to fall down at an angle instead of straight down, is because while the water is falling towards the surface of the cylinder is also rotating underneath it. So from your point of view, standing on the cylinder that's rotating, it looks like the water is deflecting as it falls, and it seems to be deflecting in the direction of rotation. And we call this the Coriolis effect. So you can feel that spin with your vestibular sense, and you can see that Coriolis effect with your eyes anytime you drop something or pour something. And again, you're having a discrepancy between what you're seeing and what you're feeling, and that could make people sick, just like motion sickness or space sickness. And studies have been done on this by putting people in rotating rooms that they can rotate at different rates and recording, what they experience. And they found that higher rotation speeds were worse in this regard than lower speeds, which, makes sense when you think about it. So the faster this thing is spinning, the more of those effects you'll feel. So the more when you turn your head, you'll feel that spin. And the more when you drop something, it's going to deflect. So the more pronounced those effects are, and the more likely it will be to make you sick or uncomfortable. Where the more slowly it's spinning, the less those things will be noticeable. So these studies are actually summarized pretty well on a website I found that also has a calculator on it that you can use to figure out these values for different size cylinders, or really anything that's round and spinning. You can plug in different numbers and say, oh, if it was this size and it spun it this fast, how much gravity would there be, and things like that. It's a pretty cool little resource. I'll have that linked in the show notes too. But here's a quote from one of those studies. So upon entering microgravity, about half of all astronauts endure what's called space adaptation syndrome that lasts from 1 to 3 days. A similar period of adaptation. Okay, so let me unpack that a little bit. So the space adaptation syndrome is, let's say you go stay on the space station, the International Space Station. About half of the people that do that experience this syndrome, which is for a period of 1 to 3 days, you're getting space sick. It's like you basically are motion sick or seasick, because it's messing with you, this discrepancy between feeling like you're not moving, but it looks like you are moving. And over a period of 1 to 3 days, most of the people, which again would be half of the people that experience that, will acclimate. They'll get used to it and they'll feel better. And again, about half the people will just be fine right away, and they don't need that 1 to 3 day period to acclimate. So a similar period of adaptation to artificial gravity or rotational gravity seems reasonable, considering the substantial health benefits that it offers versus prolonged weightlessness. So basically what they're saying is if you're going to live in space, you're going to go live on one of these cylinders, it's a pretty fair trade-off if maybe, about half the people for 1 to 3 days are going to feel a little sick to their stomach as they get used to it. That's a fairly fair trade-off to the alternative, which would be living at less than 1 gravity and all the health problems that come with that, which are permanent, a lot of them, as opposed to, or at least long-lasting, as opposed to this acclimation period, which is pretty temporary for most people that experience it. It goes on to say it may not be necessary to provide immediate, perfect, quote, comfort in artificial gravity, especially in small exploration class vehicles with select crew. So basically, you can select, like, let's say you're going to have a small ship or something that rotates. You can select people to crew that ship that don't get sick from these things, because not everybody does. Some people are just fine with it. It doesn't bother them at all. You also have the other extreme where some people react much more strongly to this, and there are people that just never get used to it. And there was a guy, I don't remember his name now, which is probably just as well, but there's a famous guy that went up to the space station that was like this. He had a very severe reaction to the space sickness, and he was sicker than a dog, and he never acclimated. He never got comfortable with it. So that's, you do have that possibility too, although it's probably pretty rare. So of course, when we're talking about a whole city full of people, I mean, we don't want anyone experiencing any discomfort at all, right? I mean, people want to live their lives out there in comfort. And we don't want to have to limit who can live there just to the people that can adapt quickly and easily. We want anybody to be able to live there. We want anyone to be able to be comfortable there as well. Also remember that children are going to be born there and raised there on these things. And, it's reasonable to think that some or even all children would be more susceptible to this possibly. So that'd be something to be concerned about. And also, for all the mothers, I'm sure all you ladies out there can agree, and at least those of you who've been pregnant, that you wouldn't want to deal with constant motion sickness on top of everything else that you have to deal with during a pregnancy. So yeah, we can't have this. We can't have people having any negative effects from the rotation. So here's another quote from one of these studies. The cross-coupling of normal head rotations, just moving your head around, with the habitat rotation can lead to dizziness and motion sickness. To minimize this, minimize the habitat's angular velocity, or its RPM. So the slower you can get that RPM, the less this problem is going to be a thing. So one of the studies conducted a series of experiments in a 15-foot diameter slow rotation room, and they observed that at 1 RPM, even highly susceptible people were symptom-free or nearly so. So if you could just spin it at 1 RPM, even the people that are really, really sensitive to this and they get sick from it pretty easy wouldn't be bothered by it, or they wouldn't be bothered by it very much. That's at 1 RPM. At 3 RPM, subjects experienced symptoms, but were not significantly handicapped. So at 3 RPM, you're going to feel a little dizzy or motion sick or whatever, but it's not going to be to the point where you can't function. At 5.4 RPM, only subjects with low susceptibility performed well. And by the second day, were almost free from symptoms. So even at 5.4 RPM, you had people that weren't very susceptible to that kind of sickness. And by the second day of getting used to it, they were able to be almost completely free of symptoms. But again, that was only the people who were very low in their response to that. Normal people and people that were, highly responsive or very easily felt sick from this, they wouldn't be comfortable at 5 RPM. And then at 10 RPM, Adaptation presented a challenging but interesting problem. Even pilots without a history of air sickness did not fully adapt in a period of 12 days. So at 10 RPM, even people who normally did not get airsick or anything like that, even after 12 days, they weren't used to it. On the other hand, another study found that sensory motor adaptation to 10 RPM can be achieved relatively easily and quickly if subjects make the same movement repeatedly. This repetition allows the nervous system to gauge how the Coriolis forces generated by movements in a rotating reference frame are deflecting movement paths and endpoints into institute corrective adaptations. Okay, so it's really technical, but basically what they're saying is even at that really high rate of 10 RPM, you could have people do specific head movements, like maybe, move their head up and down and side to side and things like that, like over and over and over and over a period of time. And it would basically kind of recalibrate your brain to get used to those forces. So obviously, we don't want things spinning at 10 RPM, but the takeaway from that for me is, let's say we have a cylinder habitat spinning at 1 RPM, which means that most people, they're going to be fine. They don't even really need an acclimation period. They'll be okay. And even, most of the people that are bothered by it after a few days, they'll get used to it and they'll be okay. And the takeaway from this for me is that even your outlying people, your rare people who are really susceptible, who get really sick, even at the 1 RPM, that you could have certain exercises that you would have these people do with their eyes and their heads that over, the course of a couple days or whatever, even they could acclimate and be comfortable, which is good news. So going by these studies, it seems clear to me that for a habitat to house trained astronauts, you could get away with rotation speeds of 3 RPM or even faster if you're only using astronauts who've proved they're not as susceptible to these kinds of difficulties with the rotation. This means that you could build smaller cylinders or smaller rotating habitats. So in my setting, the first structures with rotational gravity that are built are smaller and spin faster just because they're easier to build. It takes less materials and it's less expensive, but they're only used by astronauts and people who've proved not to be as susceptible to the difficulties. And this, again, can be tested on Earth by putting people in a rotating room. So we don't need to wait till they get up in orbit to figure out if they're going to get sick or not. And again, that's how these studies were done. So yeah, if you're talking astronauts and people who have been trained and have been checked out for this, you can have 3 RPM or even higher and you'd be okay. However, if you want a structure for the general public, which is what I'm talking about when the story takes place, not just trained astronauts, then you're going to want a structure that has a rotation rate of a maximum of 1 RPM, ideally even less than 1 RPM, the lower the better. So the bigger you can make your cylinder, the larger the radius, the larger the diameter, then the lower your rotation rate you need to get 1G. And the less people are going to feel the Coriolis effect to the point that it bothers them, and the less likely it'll bother people in general. And even the people that it does bother, it'll be minor and they'll be able to acclimate and get used to it in a fairly short amount of time. And I would think, if you're talking 1 RPM or less, or probably even the higher RPMs, as long as those Coriolis effects forces don't have any effect on pregnancy and infant development and things like that, which also would need to be tested. As long as that wasn't a thing, I think it's very likely that children born on these things would, acclimate in the womb and wouldn't have any problems at all. Now, they might have a problem if you're born on a rotating habitat and you go to Earth, which Earth does rotate, but a lot slower. They might have a problem there, just like someone from Earth would be the opposite. They're used to being on something that's constantly spinning, and now they're on something that's not. And so they might have issues with that, which would be an interesting thing. But again, because the rotation rate they're used to is so low, they'd be able to acclimate fairly quickly. All right. So we talked about how The radius of your cylinder pretty much defines how high it can be if you're only going to have one cylinder by itself, because if you go beyond a certain height, it'll start tumbling end over end, which you don't want. We talked about how the radius of the cylinder also relates to the rotation speed that you need to provide one gravity of artificial gravity. And we talked about how you want to keep that rotation speed ultimately at 1 RPM or less in order for just average everyday people to be able to go there and not have any problems with motion sickness, vertigo, and things like that. So in my setting, let's talk now about what these things are made out of. The first cylinders are made of titanium. And in the beginning, this titanium comes from Earth and is lifted up into orbit from Earth. And then we're able to get titanium from the moon, which again, it takes less energy to lift a ton of titanium from the moon and get it to low Earth orbit than it does to lift a ton of titanium from Earth and get it to low Earth orbit. Even though the moon is so much farther away, its gravity is so much less. I think it's like a sixth the gravity of Earth or something like that, that it actually takes less energy to get that titanium from the moon to Earth orbit than it does to get it from the surface of Earth to Earth orbit, even though that seems a little counterintuitive. It is the case. So first the titanium comes from Earth, then it comes from the moon, then it comes from also near Earth asteroids or NEAs, and then also near Mars asteroids or NMAs or NEMAs maybe. I'm not sure if someone pronounces it like that. And then finally asteroids from the asteroid belt. So that's where the titanium and the other materials are coming from. Things like steel or iron, aluminum, silicon, things like that. And if you've listened to previous episodes, you probably remember that I've wondered before on this show whether titanium was stronger than steel. I knew that it was the preferred material. I wasn't sure exactly why. I wondered is titanium stronger than steel? Because I had figures of how big you could make one of these cylinders with steel. And I was wondering, well, can you make it bigger with titanium? Is titanium stronger? So I looked into that, and it turns out that they're comparable in strength. Titanium and steel are about the same strength. Now, of course, it's more complicated than that. Everything's more complicated than that, as there are different alloys of both steel and titanium that you can make that have different strengths. But in general, to simplify, titanium is as strong as steel. So what makes titanium different than steel and what makes it the material of choice for these cylinders is its density. So although it's just as strong as steel, titanium is only 40% as dense. This means that a cylinder built of titanium would have less than half the mass of one made from steel, but it would be just as strong. So when you're talking about having to lift building materials either out of Earth's gravity well or the moon's gravity well, or having to move it from the moon to Earth, or having to move it from an asteroid to Earth, your mass becomes a really crucial factor. So basically, for the same amount of money or rocket fuel or the same number of rocket launches, you could lift more than twice as much titanium into orbit as you could steel. So, titanium's where it's at for building these things, because it's just as strong as steel, but it's a lot lighter. There's also a limit to how large you can make these cylinders, titanium or steel or any material. And the limit here is the radius or diameter of the cylinder. So again, remember, we're spinning this to create gravity through centripetal force, but the centripetal force that creates the gravity is also, as you're spinning this cylinder, is trying to tear the cylinder apart. So there comes a point where that centripetal force of your cylinder spinning becomes more than your material can bear, whether that material is steel or titanium or aluminum or whatever it is. And at that point, the thing would fly apart. So you do the math, and the maximum size you can make a cylinder made out of titanium that spins fast enough to provide 1 g of artificial gravity is 4 kilometers in radius or 8 kilometers in diameter. So you can make one of these cylinders at 8 kilometers in diameter. You can spin it fast enough to produce 1G at the inside surface, and it will be sound. If you try to make it much bigger than 8 kilometers in diameter and you spin it that fast, it's going to fly into pieces and you're going to have problems. So if we had a cylinder 8 kilometers in diameter, might be, say, about 5.1 kilometers in height, and could house a population of over 750,000 people. It would have a rotation rate or an angular velocity of 0.47 RPM, or just under half an RPM. So this means it would take a little over 2 minutes for the cylinder to complete one rotation. So this would be a place that most people could live in comfort, if not everyone. And even if a few people did experience some discomfort, it's likely they would adapt fairly quickly within a few days, maybe even faster if we have these exercises they can do with moving their heads in certain ways. So again, we said at 1 RPM, people would be okay. This is less than half that. So even better. So in my setting, the first commercial station that's built in low Earth orbit has rotating sections for the crew. Now, it's not, the whole thing doesn't rotate because it's smaller, but it has parts of it that rotate to give some artificial gravity for the crew to stay in so they can stay a little longer than they could in the ISS, where there is no artificial gravity at all. It's just the microgravity of low Earth orbit. And it spins faster. So it provides less than 1G of artificial gravity because it's smaller, and it spins faster than 3 RPM, again, because it's smaller. So this first commercial station, less than 1G of gravity and higher than 3 RPM. So this means that people could only stay there for a short time because it's less than 1G of gravity. They can't stay there forever. And it means that someone who was very susceptible to the rotation wouldn't be able to stay there because it's rotating faster than 3 RPM. And you would have people that just would have a problem with that. So you'd have to make sure that people can handle it but before they go up there. So that's the first commercial station built with rotating gravity. After that, they built a larger torus-shaped rotating station, and a torus is a donut shape. And this is built in low Earth orbit, and it's 200 meters in diameter. So 100 meters in radius. And I'm not going to keep giving both. So just remember, radius is half the diameter. So it's 200 meters in diameter, so 200 meters wide, and provides 1G of gravity and rotates at just over 3 RPM. So people could stay there indefinitely because it's 1G of gravity, so you don't have any problems from low gravity. But it still wouldn't be comfortable for everyone necessarily because, again, it's rotating around 3 RPM. So that's a torus. So after that, I'm thinking that the first cylinder that's built, which is where I'm really going here, is these cylinders. The first Kalpana type cylinder is built in orbit of the moon. It is 2 kilometers in diameter, 1 kilometer high, and rotates at slightly less than 1 RPM. It's actually exactly 0.95 RPM. So just under 1 RPM. It can have a population of up to 36,000 people. So this is the first place in space where people can live indefinitely because it has 1G of artificial gravity. People can live there forever. And pretty much anyone can be comfortable there because it's at just under 1 RPM. So they might need a brief acclimation period, but because it's rotating under 1 RPM, most people will, if they need to get used to it, will get used to it pretty quickly and they'll be fine. Now, as the cylinders get bigger than this, that rotation rate will continue to go down and there'll be less and less problems with new residents having any issues with the Coriolis forces. So remember I said that the maximum size you can make a cylinder out of titanium that provides 1G of artificial gravity is 8 kilometers in diameter, about 5.1 kilometers high, and that could house a population of over 750,000 people. This really puts into perspective how much of a super material graphene is, because once you can make graphene, you could make a cylinder with a diameter up to 2,000 kilometers as opposed to 8. And that's a huge leap, going from 8 kilometers in diameter to 2,000. That's just ridiculous. So graphene cylinders can get really huge, but at least in the beginning of my story, they're not going to be that big, and they're not going to be 2,000 kilometers in diameter. Remember, I want these to be city-sized. So 2 populations I'm looking at, I looked at populations of cities. And here in the United States, even the big cities, most of them are under 4 million. For instance, and not including the metropolitan area, but just the city itself. For instance, Chicago is, I think it's like 4.7, 4.8 million, something like that. And then we do have some cities that are in the US that are more than 5 million. For instance, New York is 8 point something million. So I'm looking at cylinders to begin with when they get graphene, maybe shooting for a population around 5 million. So a cylinder for 5 million people might be 22 kilometers in diameter, 14 kilometers high, while a cylinder for 10 million people might be 30 kilometers in diameter and 19 kilometers high. So the 22 kilometer diameter cylinder for 5 million people, that thing would rotate at 0.29 RPM. So just under a third of an RPM. So it would take over 3 minutes for that thing to go through one complete rotation. The 30 kilometer diameter cylinder for 10 million people would rotate at 0.24 RPM. So just under a quarter of an RPM. So it would take more than 4 minutes for that thing to rotate once. So I think at these rates, the Coriolis effect would probably be barely noticeable to people. And you definitely wouldn't, you'd have a lot less issues with it making people sick. So as far as the populations for these cylinders, how I found those numbers is I got those by calculating the lateral surface area of a cylinder. So a cylinder, you have basically 3 surfaces on the cylinder, right? You've got the top, the bottom, and then the other side, the round side. So if we want to know what is the surface area that you could say build houses on, how many square feet or square meters do we have? We just need to know the surface area of the one side. We don't want to include the ends, the top and bottom of the cylinder, because there's no gravity on those. So there's a handy equation to figure that out. If you're interested, it's 2 pi RH, or 2 times pi times the radius of the cylinder times the height of the cylinder. That gives you the lateral surface area, which again is the area without the end caps. So you can then take that surface area and figure out how many people could live there. And the way I did that, because again, this surface area is the part of the cylinder that's at 1G, is I allowed 170 square meters per resident for personal space, so that's their homes, as well as commercial space, so things like schools, shops, doctors, offices, things like that, and also agricultural space to grow their food. And I got that number from a combination of the Kalpana paper and the Space Settlement Design Study paper. They figured out, how much space each person would need. And again, like I mentioned in previous episodes, that 170 square meters, that's giving you a lot of space, way, way more than someone living in an apartment in a large city like, say, New York City has. Yeah, people have a lot less space than that living on Earth today. And really, honestly, these numbers I'm giving you, like saying, it can hold 10 million people or whatever, they could actually hold a lot more than that. Because first of all, it's not a dense, we're giving people a lot of space. So it's nothing like the population density of like, say, LA or New York City. And also it's assuming we're only using that inside surface. It doesn't factor in the fact that you can build multi-story buildings, right? Now, as you get further from that surface, as you build up, the force of gravity does decrease. But especially with these really big cylinders, that you could have quite a few stories on your building before that loss of gravity was very noticeable to where it would matter much. And you just make sure that the areas people spend the most time are on the ground floor, so they're at the full 1G, so you don't have any health issues. Also, that's counting space to grow food for all those people, but you can have way, way, way more space than that for growing food because you can have smaller cylinders nested within the large cylinder, kind of like those Russian dolls. I forget what they're called, where each doll has a smaller doll inside of it. So you can nest smaller cylinders within the larger cylinder that have lower gravity, and you can use those to grow crops because you don't necessarily need a full 1G to grow plants and whatnot, depending on the plants. So really, you could have way, way more people than what I'm saying here on these things. But I'm okay with this very conservative figure for population because you would really want a lot of space for people for psychological reasons. You don't want people feeling claustrophobic like they're trapped inside of a can. You want people to be happy and healthy living there. You just want lots of extra space to keep people sane and happy. You want lots of room for parks and things like that, so people can feel like they're out in open air and things like that. So yeah, you could actually get significantly more people into these things than what I'm planning. And the other thing is also in the beginning of this, you need to attract people to move to these things, to come up from Earth and live in space in these orbitals. And a great way you can attract those people is if they can get a much larger house or apartment or living space for what they would pay on Earth. So let's say you're paying, $1,500 a month rent for your tiny little apartment in New York City. You can go live on one of these orbitals and have a place that's 10 times the size for the same amount of money. So that's a way to incentivize people to move into space, to populate these things. So yeah, like I said, they could hold a lot more, but I'm being super conservative because I do want there to be lots of large open spaces. I want people to have lots of personal space, even more than people in modern cities have today. And I just want it to be an attractive place for people to live, to attract people to move up there, because it will, even if it's not necessarily more dangerous, because there's a lot of arguments you can make once you're building things like this that it would actually be safer than living on Earth, because you don't have things like tornadoes and hurricanes and earthquakes and volcanoes and all that kind of stuff. It's a much more controlled environment. So it could actually be far safer than living on Earth, but at least in the beginning, the perception will be that it's far more dangerous. So you will need to lure people up there somehow. And also it gives me buffer, in case, something happens in the future and we find out, people would need more space, or we'd need more space for the agriculture than we thought. I have a huge amount of buffer that it won't matter. I have way more space than I need anyway. And also I don't think, at least in the early days of this, in the first 100 years even, I don't think these things would be anywhere near capacity. Because there's a lot of reasons to make them bigger, because you can have slower rotation and more space for people and all of that. And other reasons, they'd want to make them as big as they could, even if that's more than they need as far as the people that they have. And then you have lots of room to expand in the future. So, I think in the beginning, they won't be filled to capacity. So even if the thing can hold 10 million, there probably won't be actually 10 million people living there. So it leaves me lots of wiggle room to adjust things in the future if I need to. And again, most, if not all of these numbers will be found nowhere in the books, right? This is information for me. This is background stuff. It's not stuff that the reader's necessarily going to know unless they listen to this podcast. And like I said, the figures are also extremely conservative as far as population, because again, they're assuming just one level of habitation and everything else on the inside of the outer surface of the cylinder, but you can definitely stack multiple levels vertically. But like I said, you would notice a reduction in gravity as you go higher, quote, from the ground. So maybe inside the outer surface of the cylinder, you could have maybe a 3 or 4 story building, no problem. But as you went taller, you'd feel lower gravity at the higher levels. And that's, by the way, another reason to keep the rotation speed as low as possible that I didn't even go into, is that on a rotating habitat like this, the force of gravity would be stronger at your feet than it is at your head. because again, the farther you move away toward, or the farther you move toward the center of the cylinder, the less artificial gravity there is until you get to the center and there's no gravity. And the faster that RPM rate of the rotation, the more pronounced that effect is of there being more gravity at your feet than your head. And if that effect is pronounced enough, that can mess with you and make you uncomfortable too. But with these really big, low RPM habitats, that effect will be very small, to where you can have multiple story buildings and not really notice it. It's like fractions of a G. So there we are, probably more than you ever wanted to know about rotating space habitats. But I find this all really interesting. And I have to say, there is a part of me that finds it very appealing how just kind of by the numbers this is. How the radius or the diameter is related to the height and related to the RPM and related to the gravity, and how they all have this relationship where you can, it's like algebra. You find a few of the numbers and you can figure out what the rest of the numbers are. And, it's just really great that I don't have to sit here and guess. Like I was talking with my wife earlier today, I don't know, but I imagine whoever designed the Enterprise for Star Trek, the original series, or really any of the series, I kind of doubt that they figured out how much square footage the Enterprise had and how many people it could hold. They were just like, oh, it has a crew of around 500, and probably just picked the number out of the air. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but I have a feeling in sci-fi, a lot of times that's how that's done. So I just found it super cool that this could be so cut and dry, and I could have real numbers where I can tell you for a fact that if the cylinder is this size, this is how fast it would be spinning. These are the G-forces people would feel at different levels. And you can figure that, right? So, let's say I want to know on this cylinder, how much less is the gravity on the second floor than the first floor of a building. I could easily calculate that, because if my cylinder is 2 kilometers in diameter, and let's say each of my floors of my building are, what is a floor, like 10, 12 feet high? I mean, you probably want nice high ceilings, again, to feel like you have plenty of space. So let's see, a meter is approximately 3 feet. I don't really see a metric, unfortunately. I can kind of see meters because I did archaeology, but kilometers I can't really visualize. But yeah, so a meter is about 3 feet. So if we're saying a 12-foot ceiling, that'd be, say, about 4 meters, which would actually be more than 12 feet. But let's say each level is, let's just say 5 meters high, make it a round number. So I would just take my 2 kilometer diameter, so that's a 1 kilometer radius, and then I subtract 5 meters from that. And then I know the radius at that second floor, and I could figure out exactly how many G's that would be. And it would probably be like, for one of these big ones, it'd probably be 0.9 something G's. So yeah, and I probably will do that at some point, because I will want to know, how many stories can a building be before the gravity is low enough that it would have health impacts. So yeah, I'll probably do those calculations at some point. But yeah, to me, it just really tickles me, the math involved, and that I can say with confidence, this is how big this thing would be. This is how fast it would spin. This is how many people could live there. And again, the population's a little more estimated, but again, that estimate is super, super conservative. So if my number is wrong, it would actually be more people that could live there than what I think. And they're not filled to capacity anyway, so it won't matter. So yeah, hopefully you're as interested in this as I am. But I find these things really fascinating. And, maybe once I have things more finalized and carved in stone, if people are interested, I can give some figures of the places we see in the story and what they are. For instance, this first cylinder built on the moon is probably going to be called Kalpana, or Kalpana City, or something like that. So I could tell you, well, this is exactly the size of the Kalpana cylinder, which, by the way, my Kalpana cylinder will be bigger than the actual Kalpana 1 cylinder. That thing was a 250 meter radius, 325 meter length with a population of 3,000 people. And that thing spins at 2 RPM. So that's why mine is bigger, because I figured after they built that Taurus and kind of saw, how people dealt with the 3 RPM, they were like, yeah, when we build one of these for real, when we make one that people are going to live in permanently, it needs to be at 1 RPM. And yeah, the Kalpana 1 cylinder spins at 2 RPM, which, again, most people would probably be okay, but I'm going for the 1 RPM because these are going to be cities basically. So yeah, the one on the moon, my Kalpana is is 2 kilometers in diameter and has a population of 36,000, which is still a lot of people to get from Earth to the moon, which will be a topic for a later episode and is one of the things I'm wrestling with right now. And is kind of the big final question to answer for my world building is, how are we going to do that? How are we going to get 36,000 people out of Earth's gravity well and over to the moon to live on this cylinder? But we'll talk about that in a future episode because this has already gone super long. So thank you for joining me today. I hope you enjoy this stuff as much as I do. If you have any comments or questions, I'd love to hear from you. You can email me, lexoutloudpodcast@gmail.com. You can follow me on Twitter @LexStarWalker. I also have a voicemail you can call and leave a voice message if you would like. That phone number is 951-465-5391. Again, that's 951-465-5391. If you leave me a message, I might even play part or all of it on the show. And I'd love to get some voicemails. I'd love to hear from you all. And finally, you can join our community on Discord, and please do so. I love talking with you all on Discord. And again, I share space news as I find it on Twitter and sometimes on Discord as well. And especially in the writer's room of the Discord, I talk about a lot about this stuff, about what I'm planning for the next episode and what I'm working on. And it's also a place, if you're a writer and you're working on something, that you can share what you're working on and get feedback from other people in the writer's room. So yeah, check out our Discord, and you can find links to all those things and find the images and videos for today's episode in the show notes at starwalkerstudios.com/LOL. So once again, thank you so much for joining me, and please let me hear from you. Let me know what you like about the show. Let me know what you want to hear more of. And yeah, if you have any questions about these cylinders or anything else, let me know. I'd love to hear from you. And I'll be talking to you soon with episode 13. And until then, keep writing.